Thanks, and welcome to This Sea Ranch Life. Today we'll be hearing part 2 of Meet the Candidates, where you'll hear once again from the candidates for the board of directors at the Sea Ranch. 4 candidates, you'll hear from each of them, about 16 or 17 minutes for each candidate. Thanks for watching, and now our candidates. Well, thanks for joining me today, Paul. And this is the second round of interviews on This Sea Ranch Life, and the candidates have just within the last couple of days finished the candidates forum, which was held in person and virtually. And viewers of this, I'm reminding them that you can go online on the TSRA website and listen to the whole forum and get a lot of information. So we're going to do a little bit of a follow-up and allow the candidates to expand a little bit. With that, Paul, tell me what your takeaways were as far as what you feel are the important issues around Sea Ranch. Some of those came up undoubtedly at the forum, and you may have others. Would you just care to toss out a few that you think are the more important things that you might have to be part of the decision-making process should you be elected?
Sure. Not just during the forum, but during the entire process of candidacy, different issues have come up, and I've heard from members expressing how important things are to them. I think what comes to mind, the very first thing is our office space, and we need to do something there. We need to provide our staff with a safe, of course, comfortable office space with more space because we've run out of space, and something that's conducive to doing excellent work. So it needs to be ADA compliant. We're not there. It needs earthquake retrofitting, whatever we come up with. And, and I have no idea what that design is. That's way outside my expertise. But I think we also need to, and I talked to this a little bit during the forum, that we also have to build something that we need. It can't be way outside of our needs, and it's got to be within our budget. It's got to be what we can afford, and there's got to be a lot of cost-benefit analysis in it.
Yeah.
Another issue, although it wasn't really talked about at the forum, was the airstrip. And I am sympathetic to the neighbors, to the pilots, to sea ranchers who want to be taxied up here, and they need to. But we've got issues with noise and safety. So I may have even spoken to this during the first Meet the Candidates video, but aircraft have to be right sized. We've got a finite length of runway, and we're getting more aircraft. Although, let's be realistic, it's not a huge number coming in each day. But I don't have the actual quantified number, but I suspect it's going to be around 3 landings a day, something like that. But the aircraft are getting larger. In order to be larger and take off in the same amount of space, they have to be more powerful. And with more power comes noise. And I don't know what the solution is going to be, except I do have a good feeling there's going to be limitations. And I just don't know what those limitations are. It's before planning right now. Let's see, what else? Dues is always something. It's a big issue, and I think I made it clear during the forum that the things that drove the assessment up $42 for this next fiscal year were staff. We need to pay them appropriately. We need to pay them fairly, and that's what we're doing now. So we saw salaries go up about 8%, and actually they went up 19% over the actual of this year. So, but 8% from last year's budget to this year's budget. The other big item was $300,000 for storm damage. And finally, the carryover from one year to the next. The amount we didn't spend this year, we carry it over to next year, and that was $550,000 less, and not because of anything we did wrong during the year. It's just that the prior year, going into last year's budget, we were so understaffed. We had lost a lot of employees. And so although we budgeted for all those employees, less a little contingency that they always put in there, we just weren't paying the salary. So there was a huge carryover the prior year. I think the board directors, they need to keep in mind that, throughout Sea Ranch, there are different economic conditions that people live in. And so to always remember that, and let's just try and increase the budget as little as we can. It's going to go up. Cost of everything is going up.
Yeah.
So I think those are kind of, George, I think those are the big three that I would say.
Well, let me back you up to the new or the need for a modernized office structure. And I say modernized lightly because it's not simply a question of modernizing, it's a question of actually being in compliance with the building code and fire safety codes, and that includes seismic performance, earth conditions in an earthquake. And obviously it's difficult to answer at this point. Is that a completely new structure, or can the existing structure be modified to come into compliance? And without going into that, because that's really the realm of an architect to determine that, it's going to cost the association. It's going to cost all of us money to do that. And we've all watched the construction costs along the coast have gone up. Whether they're houses or whatever kind of structure. While none of us know what the cost of renovating the structure or a new structure would be, it's going to be a significant amount of money. Any thoughts or ideas on how do we come up with that? Taking into account what you said about let's keep our dues increases as under control as possible. How do you balance those two? An expensive item to some degree and holding our dues low. How do we balance that?
Well, we're going to have to spread that cost over time. First, let me back up before I talk about where the money is going to come from. And that is, and I'm sure Menka, our community manager, is looking at this closely, is what are the needs? We need to do a need analysis first. And maybe we have that already. But I'd say that an entire campus is not what we need. It even sounds too elaborate. So how many people can work remotely? Even considering ideas like there's a lot of office space in Gualala, and in fact, I know of a building in Gualala. In 2005, I was looking for office space for my psychotherapy practice, and they never got back to me. It's actually at the time, I don't know who owns it now, but there's empty space. There was empty space there, and to this day, that space is still empty since 2005. So there's space there, and do all the employees need to be in one place, which would minimize, the need for a broader footprint? I don't know if that's the case. It's stuff that needs to be analyzed.
Right.
So where's this money going to come from? We come up with a big ticket item. Well, first of all, I think everything we have right now is collateralized because we're still paying for Sea Ranch Connect.
Right.
So, you know, we've got loans out there. I'm not sure if we've paid off the loans yet for Tank 8. Maybe we have. But I suspect that this one may be member funded. There's also the possibility that it's developer funded. So those types of deals do exist. Developers like to have incoming income for many, many years. And so they might strike us a deal of let's develop it and you can pay us back over a certain period of time with interest.
Right.
But somehow we you know, we're going to need to spread this out.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. Jumping over to back to the airstrip again. You commented that there's a lot of variables there, and you made one comment that I would say I would ask you, do we need more data on what's currently happening at there? Do we really have a picture of exactly what's happening?
Mm-hmm.
From my standpoint, it seems like there's a lot of anecdotal evidence about really loud aircraft or really large ones, or the frequency of aircraft, or which aircraft are landing there. Do we really know that? Have we got all that? Do we have enough information at this point to decide what we're going to do with the airstrip?
No, we don't have that. And there was a public or member hearing, open hearing, with planning, and the planning department, they did approve some items that were proposed for Rule 7.2. I believe it was registration of aircraft and a few items in there. One having to do with helicopters, and so, but planning decided for several of the items, we need more data, and we do need more data. So they're still collecting this. You know, they have to determine how do we figure out how many aircraft are landing there? What size are they? How much noise do they make? Can we measure it, you know, in decibels? So yeah, right now it's still with planning, collecting data, the staff collecting data or figuring out how they're going to collect the data. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. But yeah, once that goes back to planning, planning will decide what to, you know, how they vote on it and what they send to the board for approval.
Right, right. Let me jump completely. You didn't mention this, but one of my favorite topics is the fuels management plan. Not without many diverse opinions on that. Do you want to comment on that? I mean,
sure.
It seems to me like probably the biggest issue in it. My understanding of it, not being a wildfire forestry management expert or whatever, it seems to me like the biggest item out there is the shaded fuel break, and that's where we had the greatest divergence of the opinion. You've talked. Would you care to just elaborate one more time on that?
Sure. Yeah, I agree that people are in agreement with, you know, keep the sheep grazing, keep the fuel break along the entire 10 miles of Highway 1, which can really help, because that's my biggest fear as to where a fire would start. But when we talk about shaded fuel breaks, we're really, I think the controversy or diverging opinions isn't necessarily about shaded fuel breaks. When we talk about shaded fuel breaks, we're talking about that part of the forest where it meets the homes, where it meets our roads for ingress, egress. You know, we need escape routes. We need the ability for fire engines to go, you know, get in and out. And so what a shaded fuel break really is getting rid of the understory, all the ladder fuels that will lead fire up into the trees. So are the trees reaching down to the ground, to the vegetation? You know, to suppress fire, we stand a much better chance if we keep the fire on the ground and not up into the trees and up into the canopy. So you don't want big fire along your roadways as you're trying to get out. You want, if you're going to have fire, you want little fire. You want something that's on the ground, roadways clear, and you can get in and out. Canopy, like up in the forest, that's starting to get risky. If it gets up into the canopy, and I'm thinking about the road right now in my mind, Schooner. Schooner doesn't have that shaded fuel break treatment yet. Moonraker has it. Timber Ridge has it. And so if people want to go out there and take a look at what I'm talking about, you'll see sort of a thinning. It's still forest, but it looks sort of like cleaned up a bit, like 30 feet on each side of the road. Now, the other shaded fuel break where there is difference of opinion is actually a fuel break along the ridge. And we already have a fire access road up there. It reaches from Timber Ridge, where Big Tree is, all the way over to, it's the Ridge Trail.
Yeah.
If you hike the trails up there.
And that road is a remnant of an old logging road. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's right. And, if you walk that, you can see where, if we just got rid of the ladder fueled up, got rid of any canopy over you, it's a safe way of getting through, bringing emergency vehicles through there. If you imagine a fire on Sea Ranch and the congestion of cars, let's say coming down the roads to Highway 1, there's an easy way of getting from from over by Longmeadow all the way over to Deerfield by taking the access road back up in there. So we can get fire equipment through there, and if people actually members needed to, if they were trapped, that's another a way to, to get away from danger.
Right. Paul, anything else you'd like to bring up or discuss? Anything that out of those first three that you mentioned, anything else you want to toss in?
I know we're looking for revenue opportunities, which we should be, and we should be alert to them. We were alert when the land under the Moonraker Tower became available, and we snatched it up. And now we rent space on that tower, communication space. And we make some money on that. It's a revenue source. I don't know if we need to go out there and try and generate revenue. As I said in the candidates forum, we're an HOA. We're not a business, but we do need to be alert to what's out there. And some things may come along. In about 5 years, Sea Ranch Connect will be generating, a lot of revenue. Right now, we're still paying for it, but it's going to be a revenue source too.
Right. Well, thank you, Paul. Those were appreciate those points. And hey, thanks, Elizabeth, for joining me today and taking some time out of your work day, your busy day, and everything. I thought it would be great to do a little bit of follow-up. We had the candidates forum last weekend and heard on a number of topics, and we got some chance to hear what each of the candidates thoughts were. And I thought I could just do a little follow with that, and I'd ask you to kind of reminisce a little bit about what are the issues that you think, or maybe project a little bit. Maybe reminisce isn't the word, but project a little bit about what you think some of the more important issues and items are coming up, and that'll be facing the next board. Should you be facing the next board, whether you're elected or not, it'll still be facing the board. And in general, kind of what your takeaways of that candidates forum is. So just feel free to kind of free range here a bit.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for doing this, George. As always, it's a pleasure, and I think it's a great service. I think a couple of things. I think first and foremost, I think the membership has some great choices, and that's important to recognize. And that's good. It's important that we have a good board, and it's important that we're in good hands. So that's good to see. That's the first thing. What do I think's ahead of us? I think a couple of things came to the fore. I've also seen this in some of the questions that I've been answering in emails and in the meet and greets. I think there's some concern about the dues. We did have a substantial increase this year and last year. And so we are getting questions about that, which I welcome because it is a real concern to all of us. The other thing I think that I pointed out on Saturday, that I also think is important is that there seems to be a notion that forest preservation and fuels management are at odds. And I don't think that's necessarily a duality. I also think both of those things are far more complex than some of the simple we must have one or the other would imply. But because obviously forest health is many factors and fuels management is many factors as well. But I think that came out in the forum is that those things are not necessarily completely incompatible. And then I think that the other thing that's on people's minds is what did we learn from the storms and what does that mean about our ability to be resilient in the face of climate change? And as you know, because you've been listening to me, that's something that resilience is something I'm certainly concerned about and one of the themes that I'm running on. So I'm sure you may remember a few other things, but just off the top of my head, that's what comes to mind.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question about the first item you mentioned, which are our HOA dues, which as you explained have gone up in the last 2 years, perhaps more than they have in recent memory. And we heard some different reasons for that. Would you care to comment on that and sort of where you stand on that? I think once again there are a lot of reasons why the dues increase and sometimes difficult decisions. Would you kind of reflect on that a little bit?
Of course. The biggest reason the dues increased is the carryover. To explain a dull concept yet one more time, the carryover is the amount that we have left at the end of the year. When we budget somewhat conservatively to ensure that we can deliver the services and maintain our amenities that the members expect. And that includes the vegetation management, that is the critical part of our safety, and maintaining the amenities, including our commons that are important to all of us. And we don't always use it all. And as a result, we have some left over. So at the end of the year, that's called the carryover. And that divided by the number of us who pay dues is what reduces our dues for the next year. And it's a common HOA practice. And we like other HOAs do it. And during COVID times, we got some COVID relief and that inflated the carryover, and that's no longer available to us. So that's actually a factor somewhat outside of our control. We also saw this year, we have an extra $9 in vegetation management and then $10 in storm cleanup. The vegetation management is to remove dead and dying trees that are dangerous, that were identified after the storms as being threatening to people's homes, or on trails, heavily traveled trails, things that could be a danger to us. And that's essential. We don't get a choice about that. And the cleanup is also something we don't get a choice. Now, we may have some insurance payouts that may relieve some of that, and that would go into next year's carryover. Those are all things that are happening. We may get some grants, we may get some relief. There's several variables that could offset some of that, but unless we actually know, we can't say that we're going to get those things because this is work we cannot avoid. So some of our, the bulk of our dues are things that we have to deliver the services and amenities that we all expect. The amenities are important, not just because we enjoy them, but they're also important because we own them together. We share them. The by far the most important one being our commons. And they contribute substantially to the value of our homes, but mostly they're part of what we are. So that's really what contributes to the dues. I'm sorry, there's a second part of your question that I lost.
No, that's okay. That's okay. So can this board or the next board or any board? I'm asking you to speculate a little bit here because we're talking about the future. Can dues ever come down? Is Is there realistically, can that happen?
Well, realistically, it can happen because it has. If you look at the
Okay.
history of our dues, it has. There are things that go onto the dues and come off again. The one that we have right now is the $10 a month. It's been on for Sea Ranch Connect for what, 8 years? That's to pay off, that was originally to do the feasibility for Sea Ranch Connect and is now paying off the loan. When the loan on Sea Ranch Connect is fully paid off, which is set to mature in 2028, we will no longer need that $10 a month, and the board will have the option to, and they'll probably choose to roll that $10 off. What happens with other decisions about the budget at that time is, we can't predict. But that said, that's an idea. I mean, that's an example of something where previous boards made a decision about a major capital project, executed that project, financed it, and then the financing is no longer required once it's been paid off. So it's technically possible. In an inflationary period, difficult to do.
Right. And certainly our salary costs are a significant part of our budget.
They are.
And in general, you don't lower your salary costs unless you get a people.
No,
Kind of hard to ask people to take a 10% pay cut because people will leave. So and realistically, salary costs are not going to go down. They're going to continue to tick up for a variety of reasons. One that I would guess is that we have to attract and retain the best people we can, and that means that impacts salary. So we're still always going to have upward pressure for our personnel, for our staff costs and their associated costs. It's not just their salary, right? It's health insurance. It's it's all the benefits that people traditionally are paid for. Those aren't going to go down.
No, they're not. And not health insurance in particular. There are other variables. Fuel costs have gone up dramatically. I mean, we have a fairly extensive fleet, for the vehicles that we use to maintain the Sea Ranch. On the payroll costs too, we had surveys that say that we were paying below market rate. I consulted a couple of human resources experts who tell me that it will cost us more over time to pay below market rate because the turnover costs actually will cost us more. And that's the kind of policy and strategic decision the board needs to be aware of and to make well. So one of the things I remember the second part of your question is what can we see for the future? So one of the things that every board has to do every year is look at and balance the needs of what we need to do today and the burden that we put on the membership in terms of via dues today, but not shortchange the future. And during the recession, the association ran as lean and mean as possible because everyone was hurting, and that was wise. But then there were things that we probably are paying a little bit of catch up for now. So there is some judgment there. Every board does the best we can to determine what it is. We did not choose to invest in the fund for refurbishing the offices this year because of the burden of the dues. I will be honest and say I did vote to contribute to that fund because I think that's something we're going to have to do, but the majority of the board did not, and I completely respect and accept and understand that decision because of the amount of dues increase that we had. But that's an example of the kind of thing that we do have to balance.
Right. Hey, let's go back to the what you called perhaps viewed as a dichotomy, and you suggested it's not really a dichotomy. The preservation of the forest and the fuels management plan, which you just said are not in opposition. If I understood your comment correctly, would you elaborate a little bit on that? I understand that the fuels management plan will be on the board's agenda very soon.
Saturday.
And I understand you as a sitting board member right now, you may not be able to discuss what your vote is, and in fact, you may not know exactly what your vote is. But would you care to just talk about that, particularly? The fuels management plan, the controversial part is the shaded fuel break. Any thoughts you'd care to share around that?
Yeah, several, ranging from the specifics of the plan to a broader question around how our community discusses the forest in general, and I'll sort of touch on those, and you can pick which one you want to pursue further, if any. But to start, fuels management's not new. It's a big part of our budget. It's a critical component of what we do to keep ourselves safe from fire. Nothing keeps us entirely safe from fire. It's not possible, I guess, unless we cut down all the trees and pave the place, which we're not going to do. My point was, and what I was making, and I do not mean to be disingenuous about this. I do understand that people are very concerned about tree removal, but the fuels management plan calls for the shade, and let's talk about the shade and fuel break, which is what seems to have people most up in arms, calls specifically to preserve larger trees and preserve the redwoods. My understanding of which I think will be clarified when we get the staff report on the staff's recommendation, but my understanding is that the bulk of the effort, including along the shade and fuel break, is around avoiding ladder fuels. And those are the fuels that are close to or lying on the ground, because we're trying to keep the fire out of the canopy. If we keep the fire out of the canopy, it's easier to fight and it won't spread. That seems like a good idea to me, especially because that also gives us a north-south, that gives the firefighters ingress and egress, and in a real pinch could get us out too if the firefighters had to get us out. Because Highway 1, obviously we want to keep free for people moving as well. The point that I made on Saturday is, if we have a huge fire that is impossible to fight because the fire has gotten into the canopy or has burning so hot that the firefighters are incapable of getting in there, not only will our houses burn, but so will our forests. And if we can protect ourselves from the very worst of the fires, from everything, but the very worst of the fires, we have a chance of saving our forests as well. And we can, I believe, protect ourselves from at least some fire risk and still preserve the forested nature of our woodlands.
Well, great, thank you. Last time, we just maybe have a minute. Anything you'd like, any other issue you'd like to add into this, and take maybe just a minute, and I think our time will be up then.
I guess the other thing I've talked about as part of my campaign, we've talked a little bit about our resilience in the natural environment with our resistance to fire, and we haven't talked much about infrastructure. I do think we need to look more at that, particularly around our water infrastructure, but also our community infrastructure. We're going to look at some controversial stuff this weekend around the fuel breaks. The airstrip is going to come up again, although I don't think we're going to be making decisions about it. I would like us to look at ways to make controversial decisions better as a community. I'd like us to approach things in a less us versus them. I don't think we have an us versus them. I think there is only us. But there are times in which it can feel that way. And I'd like for us as a community to look at that and see what we can do to really leverage our strengths that come from our difference of our expertise and our opinion and our experience, because that's when our good ideas come from. And that's if I'm elected, that's one of the things I'm going to work on, is building some frameworks that people can use if they want to help us address controversial topics in a productive and interesting way that we can actually work with our decisions, make better decisions. And also, as I've said, which is much more prosaic, but also that we have better information available to all the membership. I want every member to have the same information that I do as a director, so that when I'm looking at information, you can see it too. And that's how we make the best decisions, and also dispel misinformation.
Thank you. Thanks for joining me today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Jeff, thanks for joining me today on this Meet the Candidates. It's our part 2. We've heard from all the candidates several times now, both on This Sea Ranch Life. We heard from each of you, You all got to participate in the candidates forum last weekend, and people may have talked to you and heard from you in other venues in other ways and everything, but I appreciate a little bit of follow-up. So what I'd like to do today is kind of open up, open it up to your thoughts and comments, particularly with your kind of following up on your statements at the forum. If memory serves me correctly, you brought up three topics or items that you felt illustrated your thoughts and concerns. And so I'd like to ask you to kind of take off, refresh our memory on those, and maybe elaborate a little bit on those. Am I correct? Didn't you mention three? Didn't you have kind of three main topics that you brought up?
I mentioned three things that constituents had reached out to me about. Let me pull up that exact.
That's
statement.
fine.
You're
And
putting me on the spot a little
I'm
bit.
sorry, that's okay. And if you want to expand beyond those three, please feel free to. The floor is yours.
Sure. Well, first off, the pleasure is all mine, George. I know it takes a lot of effort to put these together, making the time, doing the editing, all of that. So really appreciate your service in that regard. And yeah, I mean, in terms of what I talked about in my 5 minutes last Saturday, I guess that was 3 days ago, since I wasn't able to answer all the other questions at the meeting, I started by talking about three particular things that either I heard from people directly on that were their ideas, or they kind of pushed me in a great way to sharpen my own ideas from the first candidate statement. The first one was a directory of families with kids at the Sea Ranch. This is an issue, maybe issue is not the right word, but a topic that I've talked about a few times, age diversity. I love all ages and get along with all ages and have friends with friends from among all age cohorts. But I think that as much as we can do to kind of stoke the anecdotally reported uptick in the number of young people living at and or spending time at the Sea Ranch, that would be a good thing. But a directory of families with kids is just one idea. There could be many other directories, and I know there already are a lot of shared interest groups. When I went to a Breaker Reach block party, if you will, last summer, I heard about a cycling group. I happen to be a cyclist as well, but I think, just continuing to allow people to find each other, especially as, we build out the remaining lots and the population grows a little bit. And then similarly, I had advanced the idea of potentially building another playground in the southern section of the Sea Ranch, since both the playgrounds are pretty far toward Gualala in the north. And one of my constituents floated the idea of starting by upgrading One-Eyed Jack's, which I think is a little bit older than the other one. And I thought that was a great example of a sort of compromise and something that could be done in the nearer term than a bigger question of appropriating space and all the complexities that would go into building a new one. Although I do continue to think that would be a good thing to do in the medium run, shall we say. And then the other one I mentioned was someone had challenged me to get a little more specific about, and I think this was one of the questions that the other three candidates answered the other day, along the lines of promoting diversity. And that was something that I had mentioned in my first candidate statement. And one idea I had as far as a concrete way to achieve this would be to organize community gatherings and celebrations for non-Eurocentric events and holidays. So for just one example, the Indian tradition of Diwali, and of course, I mean, South Asian Indian, but in fact, Native Americans, I think that's another group that we could really court, especially with the history of the land, and I'm sure many things have been done toward that to date. But even for example, having some acknowledgement on the 4th of July, which is a thing that has been done, to my knowledge, in Australia a little bit more lately on Australia Day, with recognizing Aboriginal peoples, and maybe kind of sharing and finding some common ground and charting a new path forward.
Yeah, great. Were you able to, and I know you're away and working right now. It sounds like mostly working in a little vacation. I'm not sure. We've all been there at one point or another. I hope it's more vacation and a little less work. But during that time, have you had a chance to listen? Actually, you know what? I don't know that the forum recordings have been released yet.
If they have, I hadn't seen
Okay.
that. In terms of the reception that I was getting and where we were, I did listen in for the rest of it. So.
Okay, gotcha. Well, are there any other issues or topics beyond those three? And those are notable, of course, that you maybe have thought about or have come your way either through other Sea Ranch members or just your own coming up to speed on issues maybe that you were less familiar with.
Sure. And I'll just go through some of my thoughts on some of the questions that were posed, to my understanding,
Okay.
to the candidates at that forum. Some of them I'll say which ones I don't feel that I know enough to comment yet, and certainly continue to have a lot to learn. As I mentioned in my opening statement, if you will, that day, I bring a very open mind, and there's a lot to be said for those candidates who are very steeped in this specialized knowledge and knowing the history, knowing which way that the winds are blowing in various regards in terms of the different individuals and groups and constituencies at the Sea Ranch, as well as other stakeholders like governmental entities and things like that. But happy to go through some of my thoughts. So the dramatic increase in dues, I've been in a few HOAs before. I guess I'm just laughing a little bit about dramatic, because while it is a very serious issue, I'm a little realistic about the fact that the dues do tend to change, and I've been through that before. I guess maybe I feel like I've seen worse. That said, we wouldn't want it to be a trend that continues over and over. And in fact, to the sort of I've seen worse point, someone at that aforementioned block party for Breaker Reach, which is where we're trying to build, had actually mentioned, prior to I think it becoming known how much the dues would go up, that the dues were, in this person's opinion, unsustainably low. So I guess in a way, I had some forewarning of that, and it kind of made sense to me. Again, I don't know enough to know what all goes into the capital budget, and why this person would have thought they were low, but just kind of sniff test wise, it did make sense. So I look forward to learning more about that. I did mention in my opening statement, I am against the notion of a tiered dues schedule. I certainly see that there could be positives to it, but I live by the credo, which I've sort of said ad nauseum now: don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I just think you get into not only a lot of operational complexity and potentially waste because of that, but even things like misaligned incentives, and a term that was used when I was in business school, moral hazard. So if you just kind of game this out a little bit, let's say people paid dues that were somehow tied to their Zillow estimate or something, just to have some kind of third party or any other MLS estimate. Well, that could potentially incentivize people to actually maintain their properties worse or something so that they pay lower dues, but that would be a bigger problem for the community. So I just think those things get very thorny. I also think that, much like public school, which is to me one of the greatest things that I think the United States was really at the vanguard of. I'm a little bit out of my depth, but has been an incredible thing for this country. My wife and I both were public school our entire K through 12 careers. Our kids have been public school, and I just couldn't love that model anymore. Single payer healthcare is something that I'm totally for, is another example of where you can achieve so much with economies of scale and really pooling. The next part of that question was about ideas for raising funds other than through HOA fees. Grants, I think another candidate mentioned grants. I think that's a fantastic idea, obviously, with the architectural tradition. I mean, I had a kind of a crazy out of the box idea. Maybe there could be some sort of incubator or rental time if there were enough room or facilities to handle this for an architecture school, not necessarily on a permanent basis, but maybe a couple weeks a year or something like that. I also think there's potential for things like solar farm. Again, I'm sure there's a lot of entitlements and operational challenges that would have to be waded through to accomplish something like that. And people have different opinions on the aesthetic aspect of that. Greater efficiency in the way things are currently done, but again, just as I opened with today and as I opened with the other day, to crowdsource. Our greatest resource, I dare say, is the brain power of the amazing Sea Ranchers. Going back to the tiered structure for a second, I would say something like, and I can't remember where else this was put, but the RV lots and things that aren't directly related, I think there may be some edge cases there that could bring in some revenue and that I would be open to. I also have seen mention the question of collecting from the short-term rental community and some challenges there. I mean, I come from a family of attorneys and definitely think about, using legal remedies to try to get people to get with the program, if you will, if indeed they won't do it on their own, which would be a sad thing. Looming investments, I don't want to say I know every looming capital investment, water, roads, association offices are mentioned and all the particular trade-offs that would be involved in that. But the specific question of should the monthly amount required to finance some of these be an assessment, which sunsets rather than a part of regular dues? Again, I've not only been part of that, I was going to say I'm still part of it, but actually the assessment that I'm referring to did just sunset. Molly and I own a condo in a historic complex in the Baldwin Hills area of Los Angeles called the Village Green. And there was a 10-year assessment that just ended. I'm not opposed to those entirely. My fear with those would be that once you sort of open those floodgates, everything becomes an assessment. And I would think of sort of major, like once a generation type capital improvements on maybe a 10 or maybe even like a 25 years seems a little long, but schedule could be as low as something like 5. Climate change is an area of not only a great passion for me, combating climate change, that is, not causing it, but also some significant experience for me. So I've been a pure electric car driver for over 10 years now. And when I say pure, that's to say not even a plug-in hybrid. We've been a pure electric car family, meaning our second car, for 6 or 7 years now. And I have been an advisor to an electric vehicle charging infrastructure startup for coming up on 5 years. So I think about these kinds of challenges all the time. And I do think EV chargers would be a great thing to get into pretty heavily, pretty quickly. I know we have a few at the lodge, which I'll just be straight. I think the rate for charging there is set way too high. It's way more expensive than gas. That's crazy. It's ChargePoint, and I know you can set your own charging rate. So that to me is just kind of leaves a bad taste if someone comes to go to the restaurant and then they're just being charged an arm and a leg. The Tesla ones, on the other hand, that now are blocked by the construction were free, and those were kind of a loss leader model, as I understand Tesla destination charging. But I do think we could, add 100 chargers easily, and probably on the way to 1,000 or something on the order of the number of places. They don't all have to be public, but facilitating that. Similarly with solar and perhaps even wind. I mean, again, this gets into aesthetics, and I'm sure there are some people who would be greatly opposed to that. But I think that the Design and Compliance Committee could make it a lot easier to do some things with solar, and perhaps even facilitate with things like the Tesla solar roof, which I think has an indisputably good aesthetic look and conforms to the state's requirements of generating photovoltaic, power through photovoltaic means. In terms of wildfire and stuff, I just don't know enough about that. And then lastly, the role of the board and the community manager. I don't know enough about the transparency to know what I would do to change that. Balancing the needs of various constituents, full-time and part-time, older and younger. I would just say, along the lines of what I've been saying about promoting age diversity and ethnic and socioeconomic diversity, that I would try to do the greatest good, but not just for the demography as presently constructed, and not to sort of play God, but as to try to look ahead to where we would try to create some more of that diversity and balance the needs of those future constituents, if you will. Just trying to see if there's anything else here. Volunteering. I think the best thing we can do is lead by example, and that's why I've volunteered for the board. On with that.
Excellent. Well, Jeff, thank you. That was a great summary of quite a number of thoughts, to be honest. But that's okay. But I think viewers will be happy to hear you expand as you have. And once again, I do appreciate your time, and we'll see you out and about, and perhaps we'll see you on the board.
Well, thanks so much, George.
Thanks, Gina, for joining me today. I appreciate it on this rather beautiful afternoon, giving up some time when I'm sure we could all be outdoors enjoying something. But thanks for taking a little bit of time with me. This is part 2 of the Meet the Candidates, and Gina, I'm gonna let you have about 15 minutes, same as all the other candidates. It's going to be a little bit free range, open-ended. So you can take your comments wherever you think is appropriate or good or whatever. I'd like to ask you to think about, first of all, we just finished the minutes from about a week ago, where all the candidates were present, and there were a lot of questions and a number of topics were raised. And I would ask you to think about or comment to us about what your takeaway from that. What do you think were the important issues that came up that you feel are worth talking about or reminding folks or emphasizing in any way again? Anything at all from the positions you staked out or the comments that you made at the forum last weekend?
Sure, and thank you. It's interesting. It is very interesting, because I came away with the idea of people thinking about sort of the basic way where the association is being run, and I don't mean just operationally. I mean as well, the governance, the board, how much we know and understand, how much transparency there is, how the committees work, what is the role of community manager versus the board, and a lot of things around processes, procedural questions, rather than what do you think about solar, array? What do you think about fuel management. And I don't know if your takeaway was, did you attend it or listen to it?
Yeah. Yes,
Yeah.
I attended, and then I've gone back and listened to
Yes.
parts of it again. Yeah.
And so I thought that was very interesting and kind of played into what are the issues in front of us that may demonstrate answers to those, points. So what I mean by that is, for example, when you talk about transparency and we're looking at the solar array project, you can say, well, that particular project is in, I think the word people are using, which sounds like a good word, disarray, is somewhat at a point where, there is confusion about where we stand. And I think it's supposed to come up according to the agenda at the board meeting. And, what kind of process did we follow? What was the relationship between the board and the community manager in terms of approvals, and how were steps taken? And, why, for example, were panels purchased when they were? Why are there 3 different sites? What was the permitting process? Was there adequate oversight? And so that, feeds into the questions that were more general around anything the Sea Ranch is approaching, whether it's operational or governance through the board and also committees. And I think that those 3 constituencies, if you will, were what people focused on. And I found that very interesting because, in a sense, that is what should drive how we're approaching things and what we're doing. And it left me with some greater sense of inadequacies, I should say. I mean, there's some great things we've done in the short term and the board has done in the short term. For example, changing the community manager, unanimously deciding that we needed a new community manager, hiring a very good and seasoned interim manager, and now having hired Menka, who I think has really hit the ground running. I don't think that's an individual view. I think that's what I've heard very generally. And she was faced with some very difficult things, comes right in the middle of the budget process, and also this storm. And, and just being, sitting down with new people. And I think she was very helpful, for example, in diffusing some of the budget process angst that we experienced last year. So even though there was an increase in dues, which nobody wants to see or, have to write a check for, it was less acrimonious, I thought. And so I think those decisions that the board made were good decisions and allowed us to move forward. Where I think, some issues, and this again was part of the forum, is the board sort of in some cases delegating too much to committees? How are we looking at committees? If the board's role is to determine what is appropriate work for the committee, how are the committees being managed? And in some cases, should the committee be going out and getting some expert advice in its determinations around things that it's trying to deal with? And so I think a good example of that is when the Forest Task Force was, doing its evaluation of obviously the forest and it went out and got an expert because it decided, well, we just don't really individually have the expertise of coastal, redwood forest person. So let's go out and get one. And fortunately, they got Will Russell, who's the leading California, PhD on coastal forests, and got him to give us a view about what we were doing. And so I think that kind of direction, that relationship between the committees and the board, and also with operations, was part of that whole process of looking at, okay, what has the board done? What isn't the board doing that we would like to see changed? And I think it was also interesting because the volunteer aspect of the Sea Ranch was focused on to some extent. And as you well know, the volunteerism is part of the DNA of the Sea Ranch. And we have so many experts here on so many things that are important to the Sea Ranch. And we have the ability to draw on that because people want to volunteer. And I think they have a richer life for volunteering. And so that relationship is important. And how do we better, in a sense, coordinate that? So with the staff and the board committees, with the policy committees, and then the operation committees under the community manager. So I think I found that very interesting. And as I said, they play into very, and maybe not serendipitously, but maybe just the very result of the things that we're dealing with right now. So you look at the airstrip, you know, discussion, let's call it that, and you say, oh, well, that went to the planning committee. The planning committee had it for 7 months. And it's a difficult thing to put together in terms of, one's knowledge about all of the aspects of what people are talking about, a type of aircraft, noise, and things like that. And so it didn't get resolved and came back to the board. So is that an example of where, when people were asking what is the relationship between the board and the committees and what's appropriate delegation, I think that's sort of an area that should, kind of get you on the point, sort of proves the point as to really that's an important aspect of what the board is doing. I think that, governance came in as, oversight. And again, we can go back to solar, how that's important, for people to look at it on a real-time basis. Because I do think, and I think there seems to be a fair amount of agreement that process sort of really kind of got out of hand and wasn't well overseen, if you will, as opposed to managed. That's on the operational side, even though I think we can talk about things on that side. But so I do think it was interesting that people didn't focus on issues as issues specifically, but focused on issues that we could see would create problems when we deal with projects. And how can we fix that? And now, are you on the list? But George, are you on the list? TSR
Yes.
list?
Yes.
So I'm sure you've seen all the traffic on the fuels management Carol Rice proposal that's been going on, over the course since the agenda and meeting materials were released. And that one's interesting because what another takeaway, and what I fundamentally think, is that, sort of there are three aspects there, the science of what our forest is, how it's comprised, what it means to be a coastal, primarily redwood forest, and how do you deal with that with science? And then there's the legal side, which is the regulatory. Is there a coastal commission aspect? Is there a CAL FIRE aspect? Is there a Caltrans, aspect? How have those been factored into the analysis? Have they been? I know Carol Rice herself, the qualification that she's not making any, decision or proposing what permitting is, for doing actions that may be recommended under the proposal. And then there's the financial modeling, which came up quite a bit. And I spent the last 35 years doing financial modeling on lots of different topics, including like windstorm and earthquake. California Earthquake Authority put out a RFP many, many years ago when insurance companies wouldn't cover insurance risk. And we had to come up with a structure that said, okay, how do we best provide coverage for homeowners because of earthquake? And so my point is that brings in factors that you wouldn't think of as financial, but you always figured out what was the baseline. And in this case, the baseline is the actual forest. What is the forest? How much moisture does it have? What is the age? What is again, the undergrowth? And then you start saying, okay, what are the variables? Well, the variables are wind, velocity, direction, temperature, and variability in the temperature, precipitation. And it's a lot of simulations if you bring those all in. And I recognize, obviously, that the forest changes, doesn't remain static. So the models have to be dynamic. And I think that we need, and I think sort of came out of our discussion, is that we do need more rigorous modeling of these projects, because they all have a financial aspect. They all have a factual aspect, if you will, which is talking about what the forest is. They all have a member impact. And that's both sort of the membership generally and the members specifically. So a good example there is the airstrip, right? You've got local members who are experiencing negative consequences of the changes in the use of the airstrip. And you have the membership that is looking at it on a broad basis. And that, I think, is primarily liability. How is changing the use of the airstrip creating potentially liability under California statutes for the membership? If you're changing it from what is very specifically and historically a private recreational airstrip, and you're introducing commercial activity, done. You had 100% protection and now you don't. So, there are all these aspects, and I think people, at least to me, the members, were trying to draw out, how do we not end up in situations where we don't understand why we are where we are and what went into the decisions that are being made. And so I think that, as both a lawyer and a finance person, you could see how that was entwined into the discussions at the forum, So again, I thought it was very interesting that we could use some of the things I'm talking about as examples, but they weren't, where are you coming out on, the forest fuels management? I can say, honestly, I don't think, for the reasons I cited in terms of science, legal, and financial, and just the consequences of, for example, the fuel break, that we even know enough to make a decision. And I'm not saying that there will be a decision coming out of this, depending on how the two resolutions are, decided, or what discussion goes around it, and whether anything is, delayed for a period of time in terms of finding out more information. The solar project, in my opinion, I did come out about these as case studies in my second statement, for somewhat that same reason, because if you take what the members were asking at the forum and you apply them, what you're doing is a case study, right? You're saying, this is what happened, this is what came out of that, whatever process there was, and where are we? And so I think those were important. And I've always said that we had a sort of a rule in my team, for transactions, that you have to consider, like in our case, like 7 things in any decision you're going to make. And if there's someone who's not at the table, or some aspect who's not at the table, an interest that isn't being represented, you have to put that one first, not in terms of prioritization, right, and ranking, but in terms of starting with that, because you're going to protect your own, your own. So if there's a particular party, and often just factually, that's the environment. And so I think also in the cases, we didn't put that on the list and adequately deal with that. And again, solar, we couldn't do it at the office area. We couldn't do it at Moonraker. And now, do we need a coastal commission permit, which has and obviously an environmental aspect to it? How much money did we spend? How many steps were taken before we really focused on that aspect? And so I think that, I think people were looking for more information and a greater understanding in general, again, about how the board functions, you know, what its role is, you know, setting policy and, you know, oversight, you know, what is the role of the community manager, how do volunteers factor in, committees, and just looking at them and saying, you know, okay, this is what happens if you don't, in some cases, have a really good process and a really good set of rules that you find, I mean, rules in the looser sense that you're following.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I thought that part was interesting. I don't know what your takeaway was.
Well, this is your interview, so
Yeah, so
yeah, so that's
Yes.
okay. But I'm going to let us draw to a close because you've given a nice summation of your thoughts, everything, and I think what I'm hearing from you is process is important, and the roles of the various parties in the process. I think in one sentence that might be a summation of what you're trying to get across. So with that, I'm going to say thank you so much.
Okay,
And we'll see you. Well, we won't see you on this channel again. I don't plan on doing another one, but we'll see you out and about, I'm sure. You've been watching Meet the Candidates Part 2 on This Sea Ranch Life. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else too.